Good evening, good evening. I'm Amanda Olkey. I'm the Director of Adult Education here, and I am not really welcoming you yet. I'm giving you some logistical information. My boss, the Executive Director of the International Spy Museum, Chris Costa, is going to do the proper introduction. I'm just giving our wonderful online audience a chance to join us tonight. Now, we will be taking questions from the audience. I think those of you who are in person know that you're writing them in. You'll pass them to the end of the row. There's a folder at the end of this side. So that means the person on the end's got a little extra work. You will be collecting the index cards. And then around 7:15, I'm going to come around and get those, and I will hand them to Dr. Andrew Hammond. If you are joining us online, and you have a question, please write it in, because I'm going to come back to the stage and we will definitely ask for a few questions from our online audience. So there's no favoritism here. All right, enough from me. I will tell you, after the program, we will have signed copies of Conflict for sale outside the theater, but the general has to rush out to do the kind of epic things he does. So I'm going to turn this over to Chris Costa to do the real formal introduction of the evening.
Amanda, thank you. That was quite a build-up for my introduction. What I want to do is say good evening and welcome to the International Spy Museum. My name is Chris Costa. I'm the Executive Director of the museum. It's always a pleasure for me to hear General Petraeus provide insights on warfare and national security, in particular during the earliest days of the conflict in Ukraine. I very carefully listened to what the general said, and he provided invaluable analysis to help me, therefore to help our online audiences, to help our guests understand the trajectory of the war in Ukraine. I should also note that I did have the privilege serving under General Petraeus when he was the Central Command commander. I was a task force commander. It's great to have you back at the International Spy Museum. Thank you for doing this, General.
Great to be back. And just of note, what I'm actually doing after this is hosting a group of Ukrainian parliamentarians who wanted to meet and discuss the situation there, the situation here, and what the future might hold. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit as well with Andrew.
Well, those are the kinds of epic things that Amanda made reference to. Thanks for doing that, General. For the
and thanks for what you did back in the day.
Thanks,
he was
sir.
totally characteristically modest about his achievements back in the day. He was a really exceptional special operator, and I treasure the contributions that he made when we were at war together.
Thank you, General. Likewise. For the International Spy Museum, this event in particular provides an important platform for a much-anticipated talk with spies historian Dr. Andrew Hammond, and, of course, a conversation with General Petraeus, our special guest tonight. General Petraeus recently wrote the book Conflict with historian Andrew Roberts. Here at SPY, we think the historian's lens, when matched with the context from a practitioner participant, provides exactly the right formula for a rich conversation. We think you will agree with us. Conflict provides an accessible narrative worthwhile for both general readers as well as scholars. So a reader will walk away, in my humble opinion, with a deeper understanding of both state and non-state violence. As a participant of the Panama invasion, multiple deployments to Bosnia, Afghanistan, Iraq, I must say, and it's important for me to note, that this book reminded me of the salient principles of war, but most importantly, that war fundamentally is a very fraught and human endeavor, and that comes across with the narrative. Yet I believe the book's greatest value is for future leaders to better understand the four major tasks that are hammered home in this book, and that is getting the big ideas right first and foremost. Secondly, communicating those big ideas, executing those big ideas. And lastly, and importantly, it is adapting, refining, adaptation on the battlefield, which is absolutely crucial. In conclusion, just last month, we hosted a crucial event here on this very stage with heads of state and luminaries. We talked about the future of NATO. With that talk as a backdrop to a world facing momentous changes in terms of a geopolitical landscape that is changing day in and day out, technological changes that we talk about here at the Spy Museum, this compelling narrative in the book will help the general public and strategists think about warfare. So let's hear from General Petraeus and Dr. Hammond. Thank you.
So it's a pleasure to be here with you tonight and a pleasure to speak to General Petraeus. General Petraeus had 6 general officer commands, 5 in combat at both the 1, 2, 3, and 4 star. He was the commander of coalition forces in Iraq and Afghanistan, director of the CIA, intellectual architect of the surge, has a PhD from Princeton, graduated from the US Military Academy at West Point in 1974, has awards from the US, NATO, all other countries around the world. So I think to say that General Petraeus was an overachiever would be an understatement. So it's a pleasure to speak to you tonight, sir.
Great to be with you and great to be doing something with the Spy Museum. Once again, we did something virtually, as I recall, a year or so back, and again, really wonderful to be invited back. And I also want to thank Chris for the kind introduction. Thank you for your kind words there, and thanks in particular for leaving out the part that I was runner-up for Time Person of the Year in 2007 to Vladimir Putin. I'm happy to report more recently, in the last 2 years, I was sanctioned by Vladimir Putin as well. So there go the summer plans for vacation in St. Petersburg.
So I think the first and most obvious question is, how did you come together with Andrew Roberts to write this book?
Great question. I'd known Andrew very well. We'd hooked up a decade or more ago, admired his work. He'd already written 19 books, never with a co-author before this one, so this was his 20th. I'd actually interviewed him on stage in New York. I like to do that. Originally it started, I was always the one being interviewed, and then I said, why don't I try my hand at doing the interview, and it was great fun. So somehow they asked me would I be willing to interview him in New York Historical Society on his book on Churchill, Walking with Destiny, which is the consensus view is that it is the best single volume biography of Churchill. And we had so much fun with that one that we just kept doing additional ones. So the first one was the book in general, then it was Churchill in the military, that was delightful, then it was Churchill in the intelligence community. It was Churchill with the royalty, and we eventually got to one that was Churchill with his friends. And every one of these looks into this was really delightful because he's a delightful guy, as you know. He's an extraordinary scholar. He's a prodigious figure when it comes to producing these great histories. And we had a lot of fun together. So then he started inviting me to the Cliveden Literary Festival, which is one of the great venues. And I did it twice, I think, before I'd even written a book. And we also did his King George III, who, of course, was the last king of America. And we wanted to give prominence to the book, but I wanted to help raise money for the Army Historical Society over there in the UK. So, and my name is a draw, so he said, look, I'll do anything. I'll interview you. What should the question be? I said, could the British have won the U.S. War of Independence? And the answer, of course, is yes. As Chris would understand, if they'd only had a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign that was competent, but they didn't. So, too bad they didn't have the counterinsurgency field manual that we wrote in 2007. Actually, it's good they didn't. They might have actually won. So he's really a genuinely wonderful guy. He's also now Lord Roberts of Belgravia. That's that needy little section of London that has the beautiful white townhouses. Of course, this is why he's got it right. You got to pay for those townhouses. And he's also he's capable of something that I just cannot do, and that is still be 95% coherent after having 2 drinks on stage. So I learned a while back. I think we were under General Order Number 1 for far too long, Chris. This is a Central Command General Order where you're not allowed to drink in the war zones. So a number of us have been trying to make up for that ever since. But anyway, he's just absolutely delightful. We had great fun together in numerous, we were doing 6, 7 events a day in the UK, then same when we came to New York, and of course it ended up the book being a bestseller. The real genesis, though, was that he called me up after the Russians invaded Ukraine, and he said, there's not a book that provides the military historical context for this. How would you like to write it with me? And I jumped at the chance because I'd been looking for an opportunity to write about the 2 wars that I was privileged to command and involved in a number of other ways as well before the overall command, and then even in the CIA and so forth. But I didn't want to do a tell-all. I had these extraordinary advances offered. I mean, literally 8-figure at one point to do a memoir. It really didn't excite me all that much. What I wanted to do is do the military history of the 2 wars I commanded, and then my PhD dissertation at Princeton was on the American military and the lessons of Vietnam, but I wrote that in 1985-ish, 10 years after the end, and I wanted to take advantage of all the ensuing decades, all the additional scholarship, the declassification of papers, and memoirs, and so forth, to take another look at that, and I should add that it was quite dramatic. When I wrote the dissertation, I was a captain, I think, or a young major, and I was really looking at it through a different set of eyes, and I looked at it, 30, 40 years later, having commanded a couple of wars myself, and being much more sensitive to the reflections of people on certain strategic issues than on the sort of the battles. There's a great book, We Were Soldiers Once and Young, by Lieutenant General retired Hal Moore, a real hero in the battlefield, who was the commander of the main effort battalion in the Battle of the Ia Drang. And I read that book as an air assault battalion commander in the 101st Airborne Division. I was totally focused on all the tactical action. This time I went back and looked at his reflections on the overall conduct of the war, and it was pretty stark. So again, it was really a pleasure to do this. Andrew is, again, a prodigious historian, producer, and he has encyclopedic knowledge for really great anecdotes and metaphors as well, and you'll find those sprinkled throughout this stuff. I should also note that you'll find when you read the book that the chapters on Iraq and Afghanistan are in the first person. So I wrote them. That was how it was divvied up, and I did Vietnam, and then we split up the rest of the stuff. But when we submitted those chapters, they were in the third person, which is what you traditionally do with a history book. And it would have statements such as, and then General Petraeus went to see Prime Minister Maliki, and he laid out how concerned he was about this or that, and then Petraeus did this, and so they said it just doesn't work. So just put a little asterisk. These were written by General Petraeus. Do it in the first person. And then I narrated those 2 chapters as well. I found out that's a lot harder than you think it is. I thought I'd breeze through this in a couple of hours. I lost my voice at one point. I had to go gargle with hot salt water. It was sort of nightmarish, but we got through that as well. And then one final anecdote about how this all came about. HarperCollins won the bid. It was a very handsome advance. It was wonderful. It'll keep Andrew in his beautiful white townhouse for another year or 2. And so the editor who's going to edit the book, then we do a video conference with him and the agent and so forth. And he asked, so how do you plan to divvy up the writing? He said, I know that Andrew can produce. You, General, well, you did a dissertation and a counterinsurgency field manual, and you were a speechwriter for a couple of 4-stars, but, how are you going to do this? And so Andrew piped up and he said, well, the way we're going to do this is as follows. General Petraeus is going to write about the countries he invaded, and plus Vietnam, and he said, I'll fill in the rest. And we had a really enjoyable time doing it.
And I feel like I have to ask now, since you brought it up, what's your drink of choice?
Grey Goose on the rocks with a twist of lemon.
Oh, nice. Okay, I like it.
And then, actually, then you switch to red wine, of course.
Of course. So,
Which I'll be doing shortly at the Cosmos Club.
with the
With the
Ukrainians, I can imagine.
Actually, you don't want to drink vodka, get with the Ukrainians. I'd never try to go, not glass for glass with them. No, a guy's got to know his limitations.
So what do you most hope that readers take away from the book?
Well, actually, it's gracious of Chris to highlight that, actually, in his introduction. It's really about the extraordinary, critical nature, the critical importance of strategic leadership. What he described are the 4 tasks of a strategic leader. So during the same year that we did the counterinsurgency field manual, this is, again, my 1 year, 15 months not in combat as a general officer, what I did in addition to that, in overhauling all the preparation of our forces and training and professional development courses for commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officers, everything to actually prepare us for what we were truly doing as opposed to what we were teaching them. Also, I distilled an intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership, knowing that I was going to be, for the first real time, the strategic leader for Iraq. I was told that I was going to go back in the summer of 2007. I ended up going back in early February because the situation had deteriorated very considerably. And this construct has the 4 tasks that Chris laid out. The first and foremost is, and most important, because if you don't get this right, it doesn't much matter how well you perform the other task, is to get the big ideas right, to craft the right strategy. Same is true in the private sector. I'll give you an example of Netflix in a moment. But what you have to do is understand the nature of that war. In fact, there's a famous quote from Clausewitz. I'm sure you know the most important task, the paramount task of a commander is to determine the nature of the war, to understand it and not try to make it into what he'd like it to be rather than what it really is. So you have to understand your forces, the enemy forces, the context in which you're going to be fighting, the human terrain, the physical terrain. If it's a country, how the country is supposed to operate, how it really operates, the neighborhood, all of these different factors, and craft the right strategy. Now, I mean, you should think that military commanders ought to be able to do that after all the, have had decades in uniform by the time this moment arrives for them. We've gone, had a pre-commissioning course, a university degree, basic course, advanced course, staff college, war college, even general officer training. Presumably, you can get that right. Actually, as you'll see in the book, there are innumerable cases where commanders failed to get that right. In particular, in Vietnam, it took us 13 years to get the big ideas right. Our leadership really failed those who were on the ground fighting so valiantly and heroically and with such determination under a rucksack and really tough conditions, jungle, triple canopy, rice paddies, and all the rest of this. But we thought that the nature of that war was a war of attrition with North Vietnam, and that we could out-escalate them. And with search and destroy operations just cause so much damage to them that eventually they would have to withdraw, capitulate, or what have you. And we were wrong. We escalated, they escalated. And in the meantime, we were missing the most important task, which would have required the enemy to come to us instead of us thrashing around in the jungle. Keep in mind, these search and destroy operations, okay, you take Hamburger Hill. A lot of casualties. To do that, you own it. What do we do with it? We leave. So the effects are very ephemeral. And again, the exchange ratio, and this is where Hal Moore, I read pages I hadn't read in his book earlier, where he says, General Westmoreland thought an exchange ratio of 1 American for 10 Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, the insurgents in the South, or North Vietnamese soldiers, that was a good ratio. He said, on reflection, I'm not sure America's mothers and fathers agreed. Not only that, of course, it wasn't achieving the desired effect, which was, again, to grind them down in this war of attrition. Rather, they just kept escalating. What we should have done from the very beginning was listen to the South Vietnamese, who asked us to help them provide security for the villages, hamlets, districts in the provinces, which is what they saw as the primary threat and was the primary threat. But we were burdened with the lessons of Korea, in which the North invaded the South across what was sort of not a demilitarized zone in those days, but essentially a line of demarcation. And so we said, that's what you need to worry about. And so you worry about the hamlets and the villages yourselves. You have the guys that can do that. we're going to build you 9 divisions that look exactly like our Army divisions, even though it didn't contribute all that much to the war that mattered most, which is the security of the people. That's always has to be paramount in this kind of war. But we didn't see it at the time as needing a comprehensive, integrated civil military counterinsurgency campaign, which was what finally General Abrams, when he replaced General Westmoreland, actually planned and then began to implement. That was what we should have been doing from the beginning, and it made very impressive progress. But we had so been discredited by Tet offensive, which took place just before Abrams took over, that the trust in the U.S. government in general, the trust in our commanders in the field and so forth had been so undermined and eroded that there was no way that you could continue the war and achieve what we might have otherwise. That's just one of many examples. The French didn't get the big ideas right in Vietnam, actually Indochina at that time. They didn't get the big ideas right in Algeria. Iraq and Afghanistan, as I'm sure we'll get into, we had moments of really doing it right. The 2 invasions toppled these regimes in surprisingly short periods of time. I was a 2-star general commander of the Great 101st Airborne Division for the invasion and the first year there. But boy, did we make mistakes after that, off and on. I mean, firing the Iraqi military without telling them what their future was a colossal mistake. It created hundreds of thousands of young men with weapons and military training whose incentive was to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. And then we compounded that by de-Baathification, doing away with Saddam's party, all the way down to the level that included the bureaucrats, tens of thousands, that we were already using to help us run a country we didn't sufficiently understand without a reconciliation process, an agreed rate. So it's one thing, if you have a reconciliation process, that gives them hope for the future. But, so for example, up in Mosul, where we'd gone by the time I was at that point in the war, we had 120 tenured professors that I needed to run Mosul University, who were actually great people. They were Western educated. The bulk of them were all the UK and American PhDs. Heck, a lot of them drank. What more could you want in partners in a Muslim country? So anyway, that cut us off at the knees. We rebuilt it up in my area because I got an exception to policy to allow reconciliation. No one else did, and it wasn't really fixed until the surge came around. So again, very checkered history here. The British did do it brilliantly. Falklands, Malaysia, where they first mentioned hearts and minds, of course, Templar, Oman, and so forth. And the U.S., to be fair enough, Panama, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, the Gulf War, and some others as well. But I've gone on about this for a period of time because this is the paramount task of a strategic leader. If you don't get the strategy right, if you don't get the big ideas right, the effort is doomed. And we want the reader to really understand that. Then, as was mentioned by Chris, you have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of your organization and throughout all those who have a stake in the outcome of the conflict. This is not just number 10 Downing Street, the White House, the Pentagon, Congress. It's America's mothers and fathers. It's your Iraqi partners and counterparts. It's all of that. And you have to be open to the press in a lot of ways as well. Third task is to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. It's the example the leader provides, the energy imparts, inspiration, attracting and hiring the very best and keeping them as long as you possibly can. It is the organizational architecture that you design for it, because there's no template for this. It is allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else a lot sooner than they thought they might. It's the metrics that you use. And back to Vietnam, what was the metric that was used there? It was not anything to do with security of the people as much as it was body count. Because again, they're trying to kill as many of the enemy. And then that number became corrupted because of the enormous pressure from above. The inflation of those numbers was also something that undermined overall integrity in the entire endeavor. So you got to get that right as well. And then it's how the leader spends his or her time. This is crucial. Your schedule, your battle rhythm, as we termed it in the war zones. We had a very detailed battle rhythm for what we did every single day of the week, what we did 3 times a week, which included immediately after the morning update, getting in a vehicle or a helicopter or a plane and going out and linking up with a unit and going on patrol with that unit, small unit, outside the wire to get a sense of what they're experiencing, to see who they're working with, to be familiar with local leaders, local Iraqi units, and all the rest of that. And on that battle rhythm, you have events and activities that enable you and force you to perform the fourth task of a strategic leader, which is to determine how you refine the big ideas, how you need to change them as the context evolves, as the situation transpires, and you have successes and setbacks and all the rest of this, and then you repeat the process again and again and again, and it's continuous. This is a huge takeaway. This applies absolutely in the private sector. It applies in other government endeavors. It applies in the nonprofit sector. The context may be different. You may not be able to poke somebody in the chest and give him or her an order as easily as you can in uniform, although that's a little bit overrated, folks. I mean, people actually have to sort of convince them. And if you can't, it may be that you're not quite as persuasive and thoughtful as you thought you were. But if you look at Netflix, Reed Hastings, one of the great strategic leaders of our time, right up there in my view with Jack Ma of Alibaba, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and others who took something from a relatively small beginning and just scaled it very impressively, almost unerringly, getting the new big ideas right time after time. So Netflix began by, the big idea was, we're going to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar, so we're going to charge less than Blockbuster does. And very effective. Eventually, Blockbuster goes out of business. There's one left in the lower 48 of the United States. It's in Bend, Oregon, which is a famously contrarian place, refuses to allow its Blockbuster to die, and that is awesome because those of my generation can take our grandkids there and show them what we used to do on a Friday night. Anyway, so that works pretty well. But then, of course, others do the same. So you have competition, Blockbuster's going out of business. So he recognized the context has changed. Broadband speeds are dramatically improved. And the new big idea is we're going to allow people to download movies now directly. That works out really well. The third big idea is we're going to make our own content. Massive. That's the breakout moment. $100 million of House of Cards alone, all these other iconic series that we binge watched during the early months of the pandemic and so forth. And then the fourth big idea, another big one, we're going to go out and we're going to make major motion pictures. And he goes out and buys not one, but two major movie studios. Does so well with that one, that great metric. He got more Academy Award nominations 3 years ago than any other major motion picture studio. There was an issue there, and I raised it with him. I know him. I laid out my intellectual construct. He has one very similar. I said the movie in which Stan McChrystal is played by Brad Pitt just doesn't work. You know, I spent years in combat with Stan, maybe as many as 6, certainly 5, when he was the Joint Special Operations Command Commander, then later the commander in Afghanistan. I said it just doesn't work. Brad Pitt marches around like a little toy soldier, a wooden soldier. He salutes stiffly all the time. He has no sense of humor. Again, just does not get Stan. Besides that, I said, I cannot believe that Brad Pitt did not hold out to play me. I was played by Russell Crowe. I've never made it that far in the movie awake to actually get to that moment. But one of these days, I'll be able to stay awake long enough in an international flight to see the rest of the movie. But you get the idea here. Strategic leadership is the be-all and end-all. And as an example, in Vietnam, the great strategic leader was not French. Heck, they surrendered at Dien Bien Phu after that disastrous decision. It wasn't General Westmoreland or one of the other well-known American generals. It was General Giap of North Vietnam. They out-generaled us. And again, you've got to take this really seriously.
So that leads on to the next question. Why is it so difficult to get the big idea right? So I'm thinking of some examples. So you've mentioned Westmoreland and Abrams. They're West Point classmates together, so it can't be training or culture or generational. Or if we go back further, like you said, to get to the level of general officer is no joke. It's very competitive, it's very tough. You've got a lot of experience by this point. If you're in the US Army, you could have spent several years of very intense education. Why is it so difficult to get them right? Why do you have to keep going through generals to get to the right one? I'm also thinking of, I know that both of us are obsessed by U.S. grants. So
I mean, how many generals did it take before Lincoln found a general?
Well, Burnside,
and I love the,
Scott,
the story.
McClellan.
He sees McClellan twice, and McClellan ran against Lincoln for the presidency in 1864. And had he won, the Union would not still exist because he was going to sue for peace. Keep in mind, there was not universal support for the Civil War by 1863. There were terrible, destructive draft riots in New York City. And meanwhile, Lincoln's going through general after general trying to find the guy. Part of it is that what gets you to the top, to the very top, in a very structured, hierarchical, yes, sir, hardworking, nose to the grindstone, is not always, doesn't always celebrate the one quality that matters more than all the rest when you get to the top, which is strategic judgment. And you don't actually know until you're at the very top, because until that point, you're actually exercising leadership, but within the decisions made by the person at the very top. And it's not uncommon to have folks that, you know, they're exceedingly fit, they're sharp, they get, you know, good, great, they look good. I mean, think of the chin of Westmoreland. I mean, tall, and again, to be fair, many extraordinary qualities. He also commanded the 101st Airborne Division, as I was privileged to do in combat. And there was an accident in which planes flew right through a stick of paratroopers and killed him. The next day, he was the first man out the door on a jump to down. So again, there were a lot of really, really great qualities here. The problem was, at the very top, he didn't have this strategic judgment piece. And I think it was just not a very deep intellect, candidly. Supposedly, he had a book on counterinsurgency on his bedside table. The joke is that, you know, no one believes he ever actually opened it. So that's the challenge. And then on the other hand, the people in my mind often demonstrate this judgment at a younger age, maybe when they're working for a four-star, writing, what have you. Think of H.R. McMaster. Brilliant. I couldn't get enough of H.R. McMaster. You know, but what happened? He was someone who never left something left unsaid, as they say. And that doesn't work in your favor in the U.S. military, which likes people that say, Roger, sir. Oh, who? Yeah, good. I got it. Yep, we're on it. Yes, sir. He'd say, well, you know, I'm not so sure about that, General. And he challenged him. He was a full colonel, regimental commander, brigade commander, the largest armored cavalry regiment in the U.S. Army. And they're going to send him off to do this mission, and they take one of his battalions, squadrons away from him. He didn't take kindly to that, and he let it be known. I remember going into a meeting with I was a three-star then, with a four-star and the three-star operational commander, and they were complaining about him. So I flew out and said, hey, you know, you might want to keep your mouth shut from here on out, just go do the mission. He did it brilliantly. This is the Battle of Talofer. He did textbook counterinsurgency at a time when nobody else, or very few others, were doing that. And so he goes back to the U.S. Army after that, and instead of doing what you normally would do, I was the exec to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or being the exec to the Army chief or the central commander, one of these other vantage point jobs, they send him to the International Institute for Strategic Studies, a civilian think tank in London, not even in Washington. But when I heard that, I pulled him to Iraq. I had him run 3 different major assessments together with diplomatic figures. They were all brilliant. Inevitably, I would have a forehead smacking moment during reading those because the guy had operational and strategic judgment. But again, he was also seen as a little bit of a outspoken, you know, would complain when he thought it was necessary to do it. I valued that. I wanted that. That's not universally valued. So if you don't have the right culture in your organizations that welcome principled, respectful, thoughtful dissent, you're not going to find the right people. And so there's a challenge with getting people that, again, they're not just yes men, but they are, you know, very agreeable, have a lot of other great qualities, but all of a sudden when you're the guy at the very, very top and you're having to make those decisions, it's not always there. So, and it's an uneven record. I think that really is the issue. I should just note, you know, HR was passed over twice for brigadier general. And the third time, I'm sure it was purely coincidental, I came home from the surge in Iraq. It was still in the first year. Secretary Gates crafted this idea. I was the president of the board, of the one-star board, even though I was a junior four-star in the Army and had a senior four-star with me. And it just so happened that H.R. McMaster got picked for Brigadier General that year. And then went on to serve three-star, should have continued on, frankly, and he could have actually, but he was made the National Security Advisor. I think did an admirable job in that position in the first year and a half or so of the Trump administration. So that's sort of an example of what can happen. I actually valued these individuals who would challenge City Hall. There was another colonel, an intelligence colonel, who had, in the first year in the war, said publicly that we are facing an insurgency. Pentagon didn't want to hear it, frankly, and he was literally sent home from the theater. So what I did, Colonel Derek Harvey, when I went back for the surge, I made sure he came with me. And then one final one, there was a lieutenant colonel that was fond, he was a PhD, and I tracked all the PhDs because I wanted them working for me, same with the Rhodes Scholars and Marshall Scholars. We had the name of every one of them, and the rule was you're either working for Petraeus or you've already worked for Petraeus or you're going to work for Petraeus. There's no other option because you need the best and brightest. As I mentioned, it's one of the tasks, subtasks of overseeing the implementation. So in this case, this individual wrote articles in which he questioned the intellectual capability of our senior leaders. Actually, it was a term something like intellectual flaccidity, and that wasn't widely applauded. So they figured out how to deploy his entire battalion. He was a battalion commander. They deploy his entire battalion, artillery battalion, to Iraq without him. So I heard this, and I figured out how to deploy him. I requested somebody who could only, with all these things that could only be met by him. So they had to give them to me because I'm commanding the surge, and I do a weekly video teleconference with the President of the United States. And I didn't go back there to lose gracefully, nor did Ambassador Crocker. We dropped dimes when that was necessary, respectfully, professionally, et cetera, but they knew they were going to hear it. And so they sent him over, and then we put him to really good use. So this is, again, why we don't always get the big ideas right. And it's partly because we don't always get the most senior four-stars right.
I think you make a very compelling argument in the book that this is like the crux of it. It doesn't matter if you've got a tank that's a little bit better than the other person's tank. It doesn't matter if the training's different. If the big idea is wrong, it's very difficult to get everything else right. So how do you cultivate that strategic judgment?
Yeah, I think in my own personal experience, was one where I was very fortunate to have General Jack Galvin. He was a two-star. I worked for him 3 times. My final time, he was the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. I was his speechwriter. But early on, I was his aide, and he asked me one time, I was getting ready to go to the Rangers. He sort of, it was going to be awesome. It's the whole reason I went to that post. Then I ended up getting picked, surprisingly, as a captain for the Staff College, and so I had to do that year. But after that, he asked me, have you ever thought about raising your intellectual sights farther than the maximum effective range of an M60 machine gun? And I almost replied, well, why would I do that? That's the longest range organic weapon in a rifle company. So what do I care about anything beyond that? I got the point, So I went to Princeton, and it was an out of my intellectual comfort zone experience. And I'm a huge fan of those kinds of experiences. In fact, throughout my career, I often sought to do something different from what you should have done. So infantry officer, should have gone to the infantry officer advanced course. I finished it by correspondence, way ahead of time. And when the orders came in, I said, oh, no, I've already done that. See, here's my certificate. I'd like to go to the armor course. I just want to do something different, learn something different. Graduate school was an incredible experience in that regard. I used to think, I was at the Staff College right prior to that, and we thought we had big debates. They were sort of like this in comparison to what you had at a place like Princeton. And that's a really salutary experience. Plus, obviously, the development of your analytical skills, your writing skills, your other communication skills, and then general information. I mean, somebody asked me, what is it that has enabled you to do in Mosul what folks haven't done anywhere else? And I said, you know what? It's graduate school. Very basic concepts of political philosophy, and market economics and so forth that we now are translating into reality here on the ground. We were the first location that had a functioning provincial council And I structured it so that the big idea was I want a council that will be representative of and responsive to all the different elements of Nainoa province, of which Mosul was the capital. And so we assiduously for 2 weeks did nothing but figure out what is the composition of the population here and how do we ensure that that what we get in the council is representative of it. And we did. And then we had the first interim governor, and then pursued all kinds of great initiatives and so forth. I mean, we did investment banking deals. I did an oil for electricity with Syria. We did a heavy crude that's a byproduct of the refinery process, heavy oil with Turkey for more electricity. We had 24-hour power. It was really quite an experience. So how do you do it? I think, it's getting people out of their intellectual comfort zone, out of the grindstone cloister existence, which it defines the military. You know, you literally, those of you who have spent time in uniform, you pride yourself in working really, really hard. You know, you never leave before the boss leaves. You're always there before the boss arrives. So you literally have your nose to the grindstone. And then you live a cloistered existence, especially on a military post, because you're living with, socializing with, doing activities with people who generally think the same. Don't get me wrong, there are differing views. There's Democrats and Republicans. There's all this kind of stuff, and it's probably a bit more partisan now than it used to be. But nonetheless, it's still, again, a pretty cloistered existence. You've got to get out of that, and I think that's what makes a difference. But then it's also the individual's just sheer study, scholarship. You know, I was fascinated with counterinsurgency from the time I was a lieutenant and learned about General Bijard in the French army, who did get it right, actually, this heroic figure, and then did the same. He's a model for the movie. He plays the part is Raspigny in this Centurions is the movie with a famous actor in it. I remember one time, so I was at French jump school, and I came home from that. My father-in-law, who was also a four-star, asked what I wanted for Christmas. And so I said, I'd love a signed photo of Bijard. And so he went to his French counterpart in NATO and asked if he could get that. And then he went back to him and said, oh, but please ensure that he has all his decorations on. He said, oh, trust me, Bijard's photos always have all of his decorations on. But so again, I think you have to have that kind of intellectual curiosity. You know, a lot of people say, hey, look, Petraeus got lucky, you know, and timing, yeah, there's timing, without question. But my view is that luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. And I really very assiduously worked very, very hard to be prepared for these opportunities that came along. And I was fortunate to have, again, military positions that gave vantage points that were of incredible use later on as well. And then everything I wrote, I was writing with an idea that this will provide intellectual capital should I ever be the strategic leader and need to know, have an idea, what should the character of my advice to a president be? How should you determine that? Do you take into account all the things he has to worry about, or just the objective reality on the ground and all the rest of this? And it was much more the objective reality on the ground. So I think that's what we need to promote. There needs to be a culture that treasures that. And sometimes I think we get that right, but not all the times.
So it seems like part of the answer to the question would be ensuring that the word intellectual on an efficiency report is not a term of derision, but it's one.
That's often a pejorative term. You know, I was told, no kidding, I was told by some senior infantry mentors of mine, you are committing professional suicide by going to graduate school.
Really?
Yep. I managed to avoid that, obviously.
One thing that I wanted to ask was, is there anything that you learned about the nature of war from writing this book that you never fully comprehended or understood when you were a practitioner? Like taking a step back, looking at the evolution of war from World War II to the present day.
And again, I had this model for intellectual construct for strategic leadership, worked for me, but I'd never actually, through that prism, looked at all these other conflicts. I looked at it in different ways. And so the reason we lay it out in the introduction is because this is how we examine each of these different conflicts. Now, certainly, we're talking about the evolution of warfare as well. By the way, I would point out, though, that there are enduring qualities that can be decisive. And if you think about the Yom Kippur War, for example, where Israel's surprised, they're really on their back foot. This is almost an existential threat. The Egyptians have advanced way beyond what they ever thought they would. In fact, they were unprepared to take advantage of it. Had they been prepared to exploit their advance on the first day, they could have actually taken parts of Israel that would be quite significant. They didn't. They had to hesitate and say, what do we do now? My God, we've succeeded beyond our wildest imagination. The Israelis, in the meantime, the way they won that war was really started in many respects with just sheer individual initiative, sheer individual courage, real professional innovation and so forth at the small unit level. In the Golan Heights, for example, there was a single tank that held off 2 battalions or something, and again, and then in the meantime, all the reservists are coming on active duty because they had not mobilized for that war. So now they're scrambling. But ultimately, and then the audacity of some of the actions taken, the actions, of course, by one of the great heroes of Israel, Ariel Sharon, who encircles the just audacious maneuver. So that's a case where the big ideas at the overarching level, in many respects, were flawed at the beginning. They didn't believe they were going to attack. They didn't prepare for it. They missed the opportunity to mobilize, but then scrambled afterwards and made up for that. But a huge component was that initiative at the small unit, at the literally at individual soldier level, and in the sky, and so forth. So that is an enduring part of this that it can never be overlooked either. But the other aspect of this was digging in more and more and more into Ukraine, and we just updated it for the second edition, also added a chapter on Gaza, and where we started to see the emergence of the importance of technology in new forms. So very different from the way we have used unmanned aerial systems in particular, which are very exquisite, expensive, and here they are producing 1 million drones, cheap, small, little racing drones with some explosives added that can fly into the turret of a tank, into a trench line, into a window and blow up inside a building. So they are throwing thousands of drones every day at the Russians, doing something we can't do. And it's because of, again, extraordinary innovativeness in the community there, desperation, fighting their war of independence, of course. And every cellar, every garage, every basement is producing drones. And this is what is offsetting, to a considerable degree, the huge disadvantage that Ukraine suffers being outnumbered in manpower, literally probably by at least 4 to 1 at this point, maybe greater, and greater than that on the battlefield. That's just the population. And then 10 to 1 economically. So how does a country that has no navy sink half or the third of the Russian Black Sea fleet? The answer is technology. First it was anti-ship missiles, and the Russians move out of range. And then it's aerial drones that are identifying, finding the enemy ships, and then maritime drones produced by Ukraine that are blowing them up. And that's forced the Russians to withdraw from the entire Black Sea, western Black Sea, including the centuries-old historic port of Sevastopol. The last ship was just pulled out of it. That means that the Ukrainians can export grain by ship again. They're 25% of the world's exports for grain, and that means that Egyptians can eat because literally their food security largely rests on the ability to import Ukrainian grain. It's very important for the fiscal situation of Ukraine. So that aspect of Ukraine is extraordinary. It's also a war that is in some ways really paradoxical. It has World War I style trenches, dugouts, overhead cover, lots of artillery, concertina wire, barbed wire, use of gas, it's tear gas, but all of this reminiscent of World War I. It has largely late Cold War era hardware in many respects, albeit with some newer stuff, certainly, especially in the air defenses and the anti-tank guided missiles and the shoulder-launched anti-aircraft systems. And then it has cutting edge, on the bleeding edge of all of this unmanned systems, and not just in the air, but now on the ground as well, at sea, as I mentioned, and electronic warfare and all the rest. It's really quite dramatic. And this is why Max Boot is accurate when he describes this as the war in which All Quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner. It's really quite something. So that has been a very, very interesting one to watch. We add Gaza, as I said, in the next edition. And I'll just offer there that I actually don't think that the Israelis have gotten the big ideas right to accomplish the objectives they've set out for themselves, unless they're rescoping the objectives, and there's some discussion they may do that. But in response to that horrible, horrific attack on October 7th, the equivalent of which for a U.S. population per capita would be losing 42,000 and having 7,000 taken hostage, compared to not quite 3,000 killed in 9/11. Absolutely, again, traumatic experience for Israel. And they said, understandably, we need to destroy Hamas. We need to prevent them from ever governing Gaza again, and obviously got to get the hostages back. The problem is that to destroy Hamas, which means to render them incapable of accomplishing their mission without reconstitution, they're not preventing reconstitution. They're doing, in essence, clear and leave operations, doing a lot of damage. They have dramatically degraded Hamas without question. They continue to do it. And they even got now the senior military leaders confirmed just today. And so they're dramatically reduced in their capabilities, but there's still sizable remnants of them in Gaza. And if you don't do clear hold and build operations, you're never going to really destroy them and keep them destroyed, nor will you ever have security, which is the foundation for the ability to do anything else for the Palestinian people, or to ensure that, again, Gaza does not continue to be run by what it is now, which is sizable remnants of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a couple of others, and criminal organizations, which are hijacking entire areas of the population. When humanitarian assistance goes in there, basically gets taken over by one of these groups. It goes to their preferred warehouse, and they have a wartime economy going on. This is not being distributed the way that humanitarian assistance normally would. Now, to be sure, this is a fiendishly more challenging urban setting than all of the ones that we had in Iraq put together, Fallujah, Ramadi, Bakuba, Mosul, and everything else, Baghdad. But we learned how to do this. And the way you do it is you go in, you create a gated community, basically, and then you clear that very assiduously, and you stay, and you control the entry control point. You have biometric ID cards. The Israelis are phenomenal at biometrics. And you don't let the bad guys back in. We told the citizens of Fallujah in advance, yes, only 300,000 compared with a couple million in Gaza. But we said, we are going to make your lives better by getting al-Qaeda out of them and keeping them out of your lives. And we'd like you to support us. If you can't, at least don't oppose us. And we sliced that city up into 12 different pieces, as I recall, or 13 gated communities. So you're putting up huge cement walls every night. And we put up miles of these in a typical night. You could easily put one across Gaza east-west in a period of darkness if you're set up properly. And that's what they need to do. And I said, I got it. You don't have the force size that we had. You don't have a counterinsurgency field manual. You've never trained for it. You've never seen what right looks like. Just try it. Go a mile into northern Gaza from the north wall, east-west, few north-south walls, create 3 or 4 gated communities, clear them very assiduously with the Israeli Defense Forces. By the way, no one else is going to do this. No Arab armies are going to come in and go to fight with Hamas. Palestinians don't have anything. Contractors can't do it, et cetera. So they have to do it. You now control. And then once you've done that, you have entry control points to the rest of Gaza. Again, you got to have a biometric ID card to come and go. They control that, but then they can thin out. And that's when you can bring in Arab forces, Palestinian security forces. You can restore basic services, humanitarian assistance in an organized fashion. Contractors can help. NGOs can do their job without being hijacked by criminal groups. And then do it again and again. Just rinse and repeat. Yes, it gets really tough around Gaza City, over 1 million. You're going to have to slice and dice that one up in various ways that will require a bit of creativity. Yes, you have 350 miles of tunnel or whatever it is, which is a huge, huge challenge, but they can find those, they can block them and render them impassable. Again, this is what needs to be done if they truly want to achieve the destruction of Hamas and prevent them from governing and provide a better future for the Palestinian people, which I think should be their objective as well, and should be a stated objective. Because again, that's the only way that you're going to ever get moderate governance in there if you have all of the grievances resulting from very, very destructive combat in that territory, large number of civilians that have been killed along with large number of Hamas. I don't see any alternative. I know that they don't want to reoccupy. I know that we don't want to reoccupy, which I think is wrong. Other countries will question it. If you're going to provide a better future for the Palestinian people and therefore a long-term solution to Gaza, as opposed to the short term where you have degraded Hamas and then you control all the entry into it and you keep them degraded, eventually that's not going to be sustainable. Well, big ideas.
Last question from me. How does an institution like the U.S. Army bank knowledge or bank lessons learned?
This is a great question.
Because it seems to me that this runs through the book as well. People that overlook things that are obvious.
You have to institutionalize all of this. And so one of the beauties of the job that I did have, the non-combat command that I had as a 3-star, was that it oversaw all the schools and centers and all the rest of that, training scenarios, all the professional military education for the commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officers, the staff college, the school of advanced military, the doctrine center, the Center for Army Lessons Learned, Center for Army Leadership. You had 6 different hats. And by the way, if you keep those spinning fast enough and you have the full support of the Chief of Staff of the Army, who told me, I asked him, what do you want me to do? He said, shake up the Army, Dave. I said, I can do that as long as you have my back. But if you keep that spinning, nobody knows what hat you're wearing. They just do what you ask them to do. And it's pretty effective. So there's an acronym that's used in the institutional side of the U.S. Army. It's called DOTLM-PF. And to institutionalize what you're learning on the battlefield, you need to take actions in each of the areas of these acronyms. So D is for doctrine. So you've got to update your doctrine. That's your intellectual foundation, after all. And of course, we did the counterinsurgency field manual. We did the human intelligence collection operations manual and a variety of others. You have to, O is organizational structure. You have to adapt, change, refine your organizational structures to reflect what's going on the battlefield. T is training. We had to dramatically overhaul the training preparation of our forces. We were still doing tank-on-tank warfare out in the Mojave Desert. I mean, we weren't doing that out there. So we created villages and used Iraqi American role players, had insurgents, had extremists, had host nation security forces, imams, mayors, all of this, and made it very complex, improvised explosive devices, et cetera. Then you have L is leader development. This is controlling, again, all of the basic, advanced, staff college, all these different courses that we offer, typically for many tens of thousands at any given time. M is materiel. You have to get V-shaped hull vessels. You got to get more drones, all of that kind of stuff. And the requirements for that is how you drive that. And then P is personnel, a variety of personnel practices and so forth, and requirements. And then F is facilities to enable you to do this, particularly when it comes to the training that you're conducting. So when I was commanding in Iraq and also in Afghanistan, once a month on my battle rhythm, I would have an hour-long video conference with my successor at Fort Leavenworth, who had all these different hats, and we would go through this using that acronym to guide it. And I had a whole team that would distill what needed to be changed so that we could institutionalize it, not just learn it out on the battlefield.
This is a good question. The best strategic leaders reflect on their experiences. What is the biggest lesson that you've learned from a suboptimal choice?
A suboptimal choice is a really good question, actually. I guess, again, if you go back to those instances I cited where you fire the entire Iraqi military without telling them how they're going to help them provide for their families and themselves, and you compound that by firing the Ba'ath Party down. You needed to fire the top of the Ba'ath Party. In fact, we were proud to kill Saddam's sons when they resisted arrest early on in the 101st Airborne Division area. But again, when you got to level 4, it's just tens of thousands of bureaucrats. We needed those bureaucrats, actually. And by the way, when they're fired, there's no other job for them. There's no real other private sector. Everything in Iraq was run by the government, owned by the government. Even the hotels turned out they're actually owned by the Ministry of Tourism and Trade or something like that. So if you're not working for the government, you are out, period. There's nothing remotely comparable for you. So the lesson of that was, just as I always had a sign on the wall that asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? Because it's very possible you go after a serious bad guy, but the way you do it kills so many innocents or something, does so much damage that it actually undermines what you're trying to do. And it creates more bad guys as a result. And if the answer to that was, no, it will not take more bad guys off the street, then you're supposed to retool the operation to get to yes. If you can't get to yes, you're supposed to go sit under a tree until the thought passes. In this case, it applies to policies too. And this case created vastly more individuals with an incentive to oppose the New Iraq than it did to support it. So I think that universal lesson was driven home more by those two instances. There's some other cases as well, Abu Ghraib and a variety of others, that were indelible. They have no half-life. They never go away. But I think that's the single biggest question you have to constantly ask yourself in the conduct of these kinds of operations.
And this is a big one. What is the most dangerous national security threat the United States faces today, and what can be done to prevent it?
Well, let me set the context for this. Is nobody, if you've seen what happens in war, if you've been the CI director where you realize you have to accept the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be. And if you'd truly like to see as the most beneficial relationship possible between the U.S. and the number 2 economy in the world, China, and also our allies and partners with China, that's the premise. The problem is that their actions on the world stage have increasingly been more concerning, and the result is an enormous number of sanctions, tariffs, protectionist measures, industrial policy, all the rest of this, but real friction. This is described as severe competition. We have to make sure it can't erupt into actual confrontation. How do you prevent that? By having a comprehensive, integrated, whole of governments with an S on the end, so all of our allies and partners together, approach to China, recognizing that sadly there's one glaring absence in this comprehensive approach, which is the absence of a trade component. We should have passed the Trans-Pacific Partnership when the previous administration controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House and had fast-track authority. Did not. It became a populist issue, and we missed a huge opportunity. But other than that, we actually have, the previous administration, to their credit, changed the conversation on China. It is all China all the time. That doesn't mean that Russia is not terribly menacing and threatening, or North Korean nuclear program, or Iran, or Islamist extremist groups, or cyber threats, or populism, or manifestations of climate change, all of which are hugely challenging. But the one that matters, if you think of the U.S. with our allies and partners as the guy in the circus tent that keeps a bunch of plates spinning simultaneously, and all these different challenges I've mentioned deserve their own plates, and sometimes there's many different plates represented in one category. The plate that matters most, in fact, it matters more than all the others put together, is the plate that represents the U.S.-Western relationship with China. And to the extent that we can, we have to ensure that it doesn't even wobble. But to do that, we've got to have this kind of approach I described. The foundation will always be military, but it takes all the other aspects and all of this together with allies and partners as well. And that's crucially important. We have to transform our forces in the meantime from a small number of large platforms to a massive number of unmanned systems. You'll still have the traditional, you should keep many aspects of the legacy force, but you have to transition substantial quantities to what is going to be the new form of combat, which we're seeing in Ukraine. In fact, the Indo-Pacific commander, brand new, mentioned in an article, in an interview with the Washington Post, that he wants to turn the Taiwan Strait into a hellscape for the Chinese if they ever try to make that amphibious operation across 100 miles of open sea. And the way they will do that is largely with unmanned systems underwater, on the surface, in the air, on ground, in space, even in cyberspace, there are the equivalents as well. So that's what needs to be done in that case. And it's really the central issue, I think, for our country and the world writ large.
Mm-hmm. How has social media changed leadership in warfare?
First of all, Ukraine is the first conflict in which you see the incredible degree of transparency on the battlefield. You've never had to contend with this in the past. And it comes because everyone has a smartphone, internet access, even if it's with something like Starlink, and then social media platforms under which it can upload photos, videos, and all the rest of that. That is absolutely unique. And it enables you, if you're a really assiduous user of, again, the open source that are out there, and the CIA, by the way, publicly, it has an open source center, so it's doing all it can to exploit this as well. But you can actually feel this battlefield, and I'm pretty assiduous about this. I use some aggregation tools that actually are very, very helpful in that regard. We rely on the Institute for the Study of War, which does, I think, the best analysis and maps and so forth. I'm on the board, and we also have the Petraeus Center at that institute. You can actually feel this conflict in a way that I could never feel any conflict from afar in the past. So that is quite transformative. But then you have social media, which can be all over the place. Of course, there's not that much, not many checks and balances on, for example, X, Twitter, as there used to be. You have an awful lot of disinformation. The enemy takes advantage of that. You're going to have deep fake videos and all the rest of this that can be very damaging. So what you have to do is understand that ecosystem, and you have to respond to it. You know, one of the lessons of, again, Iraq and Afghanistan was that you can't follow the old adage of, you know, as a military guy, when dealing with the press, you can never go wrong by keeping your mouth shut. Actually, you can't, because you're not getting your message across. And I said, we have to engage. And I was more open, I think, to the press than anyone, certainly in contemporary history, as a battlefield commander. Now, there were times that, you know, I was called a celebrity general. That was a term of endearment with President George W. Bush, who needed a celebrity general, frankly, because the war effort had been discredited when we began the surge. But then, frankly, was not as viewed as a term of endearment with the subsequent administration, where it was seen as more of a rival. I was told at one time, you know, there's room inside the Beltway for one superstar, and it's not going to be you. It's going to be the guy in the Oval Office. But instead, I would still do it the same. I think you have to be very accessible. But you also have to have a structure that enables you to respond to this. It's a little bit like a political campaign war room. And it used to be, again, when I was commanding, you had to respond to print media, television, radio, and the early days of sort of internet, but nothing like now. And the proliferation of social media platforms, of all of these different silos, the orientation of some of them, which are very, very clear. Frankly, the advent of 24-hour news that very clearly is supporting one party or one candidate over the other. All of this is new. You've got to understand it, and you have to respond to it. And it takes a lot more capacity and capability to do that now than it did in the past.
Mm-hmm. And I believe we've got a question from Zoom.
Yes, we want to include our online audience. This is just a tiny little question. What do you believe the Russian objective in Ukraine is today?
To eliminate Ukraine as an independent country, to control it, and then to use that as a platform to do the same to Moldova, which is just to the west of Ukraine, where the Russians still have 1,500 paratroopers left over from the Cold War, believe it or not. They're in a sliver of land called Transnistria. It's the most economically depressed part of Moldova, but they can't get them out. They have tried to undermine the government there repeatedly, and that would be the next target. You know, keep in mind that Vladimir Putin is very clear about all this. He was asked what was the worst geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. A lot to choose from, 2 world wars, a Great Depression, a few others. And he said the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That gives you a real insight to what it is that he is seeking to do, which is reassemble as much of the Soviet Union, especially the former Soviet republics, or perhaps the Russian Empire, do it as you will. And that's what he's intent on doing. And after Moldova will be Lithuania or one of the other Baltic states. So he has a grievance-filled, revisionist, revanchist view of history, and that's what drives him. And he is also, of course, a brutal, kleptocratic dictator whose opponents end up falling out of buildings, on planes that blow up in the air, in the gulag, or get poked by pointy ends of umbrellas on sunny days. So he is, again, the personification of evil, and he cannot be allowed to succeed in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. And I, in the preparation for this interview, I was thinking, is there anything that General Petraeus hasn't discussed in public that I could maybe ask him about? And one thing that came to mind, I was thinking of John Keegan's great book, The Mask of Command, about the presentation of self as a leader.
Yep.
So I wondered, is there...
You have to be very conscious of that.
Yeah, I wondered if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yep. That's not something I talk about a great deal, but look, command in something like the surge in Iraq, especially when the casualties are particularly high, is a grinding experience. You have all the same emotions that everyone else has, but you don't show them. Everyone is literally taking their lead from you. They're watching to see if your shoulders slump, if you melt, if you whatever. And that is a crucial component of leadership. People are watching you constantly. And what you've got to do, you have to sincerely is the best way to do it, but just recognize that is the reality. There's a great comment on Robert E. Lee. I think it might have been in Bruce Catton's Grant Takes Command, which I was actually reading during the surge a few pages each night before it would fall out of my hands on the floor. And it talks about Lee. He's being pursued by Grant. This is what's leading up ultimately to Appomattox, but he's still trying to maintain control of his army. They're racing forward as fast as they can, but they're starving. And so he gets word that there's a bunch of rail cars on a siding a mile or two ahead. And so he races forward on Traveler, his horse. He throws open the doors of this boxcar. He looks inside, and it's not food, it's ammunition. And the description of him is that he stays erect, he wheels around on Traveler, his shoulders do not slump. But that's the kind of issue that we're discussing here. And I think you do have to be conscious, very, very conscious of it. You can't act totally. Troops will see through that. I've often said, the troops could really know if you actually, everybody talks about loving the troops. That's not always the truth. There's some that really aren't all about that necessarily, and they'll see that. So again, but you have to be conscious that others are following your lead very, very assiduously. And you have to ensure, remember I said, overseeing the implementation, the example, the inspiration, the energy. So all of that you have to be conscious of.
Mm-hmm. And just briefly, we're running out of time. Did you explicitly set out to cultivate that, like on a yellow legal pad, you thought this is what I'm going to do, or did you just
not on a yellow legal pad, but in the back of my mind?
Feel your way through it as
no,
you
I
went
think,
along?
And I was very fortunate along the way to be aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army. Actually, I was a speechwriter for one first, then aide to the Chief of Staff of the Army and his assistant exec, and I traveled with him. The exec did not. So 2 full years, almost 24/7 with him. Then to be speechwriter for the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, having already been his aide at a 2-star and then a special assistant when he was a 4-star in Southern Command, temporary duty, but I continued to do it virtually when I went back to West Point where I was teaching. And then he pulled me out a year early. And then, the best of all, the executive officer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, I mean, he is the man who is advising the president, and you're in every meeting before he goes to the White House. You're with him on Capitol Hill. You're on every trip. Those are pretty extraordinary positions. And then you get to watch other great leaders like General Jack Keane, who still see on Fox he's got judgment. He has this like you wouldn't believe. I think unequaled by anyone else. He just gets the essence of the issue. He was hugely important in being the public face of a think tank study done by the American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Fred Kagan, on the surge before we conducted the surge. It was very, very helpful. And he was, again, the face of that, and an incredibly persuasive and effective face, so much so that he was in the Oval Office and with Vice President Cheney's office fairly often, and he would come out and visit. And because, he'd literally been standing next to me when I got shot as a battalion commander. That's how close we were. He held my hand all the way first to the post hospital, then to Vanderbilt Medical Center where I had thoracic surgery. And Dr. Bill Frist showed up off the golf course. Keep in mind what he did after he was a thoracic surgeon, majority leader of the Senate. I used to note I was dying to meet Bill Frist. And it was very, very helpful to me because I had a line directly to him in those years, and I was only a 2 and then a 3-star. And yet I could get the ear of the majority leader of the Senate, even when the chain of command wasn't pushing up what I was hoping to do. So, look, all of these, what you've touched on are all very important components of the exercise of leadership really at any level. But when it gets to strategic leadership, it's particularly important. But there you have to just keep coming back to something we have underscored here so many times, and that is getting the big ideas right. And I think right now, the big idea for me is that I have to get off this stage and get in a car and get over to the Cosmos Club to host a bunch of Ukrainian parliamentarians. I thank you so very much.
If you